We are still asking the questions today. Why did the crown jewels go missing? Where did they go? Who took them? Can those answers now be explained?
It has politics involved in it, it has conspiracy, it has sex and scandal, and it has the highest people in the realm, all involved.
If there wasn't a curse attached to them at the start, that there have been plenty of curses attached to them ever since.
It is one of the most intriguing jewel heists of the 20th century, a story some of the most powerful men in the world tried to bury in the archives. In 1907, a fortune in royal jewels were stolen on the eve of the King's visit to Ireland. The ensuing investigations threatened to unearth a trail of cover-up and scandal that would have rocked the British monarchy to the core. The true story of the Irish crown jewels was never meant to be told.
One of the things that hits you immediately is the grandeur of the title, the Irish crown jewels. It sounds so wonderfully romantic.
I would imagine the reaction of most people in Ireland would be, what are the Irish crown jewels? I didn't know we had any.
The Irish crown jewels really did exist. They were a hugely important symbol of the 1,000-year bond between Britain and its oldest dominion, Ireland. In June 1907, Britain's empire straddled half the world, and Edward VII was king. Since the death of his mother Victoria, Edward had been trying to reinvent himself and convince his subjects that the once feckless playboy prince was now a world-class statesman. His Irish visit would show just how well this transformation was succeeding.
If we want to get an impression of the reaction to Edward VII, we've only got to look at James Joyce's Dubliners. In Ivy Day in the committee room, when you have the men talking around and they're saying, well, here's Edward, he's been kept out of things by his old mother for a long period, he's a new man, he's a bit of a laddo, he enjoys himself with the women from what we hear, and you know what's wrong with that, and what did you expect from them anyway? It's that kind of monarchy which had some sort of appeal in Ireland, and could have survived in Ireland. Edward had a geniality which in certain ways was rather enforced. He was an extremely selfish man, but that kind of thing didn't come out very obviously. And so his reputation of being the uncle of Europe, the peacemaker, all of this sort of thing, that went over quite nicely in Ireland.
But Edward's empire, rigid and inflexible, was in the beginnings of decline. In Ireland as elsewhere, nationalism was stirring, and Edward's royal visit was a vital opportunity to shore up support for his monarchy and demonstrate the loyalty of the faithful Irish subjects. The trip was meticulously planned. The highlight of the visit would be an extravagant ceremony, the investiture of a loyal peer into Ireland's very own company of royal knights, the most illustrious Order of St. Patrick.
The Order of St. Patrick was the national honour of Ireland for 140 years. There were 146 Knights of St. Patrick, and many of them were the cream of the Irish peerage in terms of honour and merit and reputation.
I go every Sunday to St. Patrick's Cathedral, and where I sit, I look right up into the stalls of the Knights of St. Patrick's that have their ceremonial helmets, then their standard above that, and at the back of each stall, in the lovely carved wooden Gothic stalls, there is the coat of arms and insignia of whichever knight it was, and that does give you a wonderfully romantic feeling of tradition and stability and authority.
To encourage the unstinting loyalty of the Irish knights, The British Crown presented the order in 1830 with a collection of magnificent jewels to be worn by their Grand Master. These became known as the Irish Crown Jewels. The centerpiece was the Grand Master's star, set with 400 Brazilian white diamonds. At its center, a shamrock of emeralds set on a ruby cross. Loyal Ireland nestling happily in the Empire's grasp. A harp of diamonds surmounted the Grand Master's jewel badge, and the 18-karat gold collar was studded with rubies and emeralds. The jewels alone were worth well over £1 million, but the symbolic value of the collection made it priceless. The Irish Crown Jewels were kept in the securest place possible, in a safe inside the Office of Arms, in the heart of Dublin Castle. Locked in Britain's most impregnable Irish stronghold, the jewels were protected night and day by both the police and the Crown forces stationed there. At the end of June 1907, as Ireland prepared for King Edward's visit, Dublin Castle was the last place in the country the authorities would have expected trouble. But trouble is what they were going to get. Nothing marked out the night of Friday the 5th of July as unusual. With the king already on his way, security in Dublin Castle was reported as watertight. But sometime before Saturday morning, someone gained entry into the Office of Arms and stole the Irish Crown Jewels. It was a stunning raid striking at the very heart of Britain's colonial power base. As the naval escort fired its salute across Dunleary Harbour, King Edward awoke expecting headlines to announce his glorious arrival. What he got was something else entirely.
Disappearance from Dublin Castle.
This sensation was created in Dublin by the announcement that a daring Jew robbery had been perpetrated.
Every effort has been made to prevent the news from
So great are the improbabilities surrounding the whole occurrence.
Details of the affair, descriptions of the exact nature of the missing
The
item.
affair has caused the greatest
Yet
consternation.
apparently no clue
Every
has been
fear that the jewels may never be recovered.
Around the world, newspapers leapt on the story. The theft was a singular embarrassment for the Empire and a stinging insult to the king himself.
This was a major event. It really shook the Liberal government, and it certainly shook the Irish government.
The theft of the jewels would have been of considerable importance even in Britain, particularly if they thought that there was that it was a preliminary to something else. If this was just a lesson to say that the security could be penetrated, then obviously there would have been concerns as well about the safety of any royal visitor.
It was too late for the king to cancel his visit, now completely overshadowed by the audacious robbery. The investiture was cancelled. Edward put on a brave face, dutifully attending what events remained on his calendar. But despite the rousing reception from the Irish, he was not a happy man.
King Edward VII was furious. There's no doubt about that. He was furious at the theft of what were his jewels. They were crown jewels. They belonged to him.
And he was rather an irascible person. He suffered from gout, and he smoked too many cigars, and he drank a bit too much. And I can imagine him with a hangover in the morning, having arrived in Ireland, to be told stuff is all gone, it's disappeared.
On his departure, the king made it abundantly clear to his representative in Ireland, Viceroy Lord Aberdeen, that he wanted his jewels back.
Here was something which had been a present from a king of England and which had been given to an order of chivalry, which was one of the great orders of chivalry in the British monarchy and indeed in the British Empire. And now they were gone. Now they had been stolen.
Attention now turned to the guardian of the Irish crown jewels, the Chief Herald of Ireland, Sir Arthur Edward Vickers. Even at this stage, he could never have foreseen that his fate would be forever entwined with the loss of the Irish jewels.
Sir Arthur Vickers, I think words like prissy, fussy, fastidious could be used to apply to him. Also, he was very particular about his work, and in fairness to him, he was very dedicated to his work. Nowadays, he would be described as an anorak, but they didn't have anoraks in the 1900s. They had greatcoats, so maybe he was a greatcoat.
Vickers was a conscientious administrator who had worked tirelessly to maintain the prestige of the Order of St. Patrick. He had been busy moving the Order's headquarters from a rundown part of Dublin Castle to its splendid new location in the elegant Bedford Tower. The move had gone well, except for one small detail, something that would haunt Arthur Vickers for the rest of his life.
It was unfortunate that the safe which was provided to house the crown jewels, it was just too big to go into the strong room. It wouldn't fit through the door. To us, frankly, that sounds like something out of a comedy film. You would have thought that they would have done their research and done the measurements and ensured that one would have gone into the other. But, for whatever reason, it wasn't done. And consequently, Arthur Vickers was left with this huge safe which wouldn't go into the strong room where it should have gone, and there was nothing for it but to leave it out in the library of the Office of Arms.
The safe with the so-called Irish crown jewels becomes a bit of a novelty in this room around which they work on a day-to-day basis. They actually showed people that they knew and relatives as a kind of a feature of their visit to the office. They would say, well, would you like to see the crown jewels now? And they'd open the safe and everybody could have a look. So they become a novelty in this unusual location.
There was no doubt that there was a certain casual air in the office. Of course, it was a very busy time. The king was about to come, but that is no excuse when you're the person ultimately responsible for not checking up on such things, but you never imagine such a thing is going to happen until it does.
A safe is a safe. It was in a locked room in Dublin Castle with guards outside. I would think that Arthur Vickers had every reason to suppose and to believe that the crown jewels were perfectly safe.
But Vickers was wildly mistaken. It was an office messenger, William Stivey, who discovered the theft. Arthur Vickers had given Stivey his key to put a knight's collar in the safe. But Stivey found the safe was already unlocked. Alarmed, he called to Sir Arthur. Vickers opened the door and to his horror found the empty case and a blue silk ribbon. The Irish crown jewels were gone.
The only thing left intact in the safe, and Vickers reached in and took it out, were the letters patent, which appointed him Ulster King of Arms. They made him responsible for the actual jewels.
The castle had been breached, the Bedford Tower entered, and a fortune in jewels stolen. There was no sign of forcible entry. The safe had been opened with a key. Arthur Vickers held the only known copy of that key.
Quickly became apparent that the Dublin Metropolitan Police didn't have the kind of expertise required to investigate the whole thing. Ultimately, what happened was Scotland Yard was called in.
Hopes were high for the swift recovery of the jewels, as the Yard sent one of their best detectives, Chief Inspector John Kane. Kane had a formidable reputation, and it didn't take him long to uncover just how embarrassingly lax security in Dublin Castle had actually been.
Kane was of the opinion that it was an inside job, that there was inside collaboration in the theft, even if an insider had not physically stolen the jewels. And to him, the ribbon that remained in the safe was the key to that, because as far as he was concerned, no professional thief would have taken the time to remove that.
But even more intriguing revelations were starting to emerge. It seems the Bedford Tower had been witness to a series of very strange events. On the mornings preceding the theft, Kane discovered the doors to both the Bedford Tower and the strong room had been found open. Was this some sort of sign? Did someone want the alarm raised earlier? Above all, Arthur Vickers had not been behaving in his usual vigilant manner.
Stivey had never opened the safe before. He'd seen it open, but he never opened it. And Vickers follows him down. I believe that he wanted somebody present as a witness for the opening of the safe. And that's why he gave Stivey the key. And that makes me believe that he already knew the jewels were gone. He believed that he was being hoaxed.
Kane's biggest revelation came with the discovery that this wasn't the first time the jewels had been taken without permission.
One of the things that emerged was the discovery that the Bedford Tower was more than just a repository for the crown jewels and was more than just the seat of Ulster King of Arms. It was party town, because frequently after-hours drinking parties would take place in Vickers' office, which is directly above where we're standing at the moment.
In Christmas of 1906, Sir Arthur Vickers, as was his custom apparently, had a few too many drinks and apparently he fell asleep. Lord Haddo, as a prank, took his keys and removed the crown jewels from the safe, and apparently he placed them on Sir Arthur's desk upstairs. When Sir Arthur came into work the next day, he of course found the crown jewels sitting on his desk, and he was quite upset by the whole thing, and everybody had a great laugh about it. And the thing is, the story circulated throughout the castle.
And so Vickers had waited, keeping quiet and hoping the jewels would reappear. It seems the only possible explanation for his strange behavior prior to the theft.
He knew as the date of the king's arrival was approaching, he would have to account for the jewels. And the fact that the strong room door had been left open that morning was just too much for him. He gave in at that stage and decided that he had to report the theft. So the game of bluff was over. Vickers had cracked.
After the theft of the Irish crown jewels, the finger of suspicion pointed initially at Sir Arthur Vickers. Vickers was immediately cleared of any wrongdoing. Not only were the crown jewels stolen, but his mother's jewelry was also taken. Vickers would have had no reason to ruin his career by shamming the theft of the crown property.
He had reached, after a long climb, the pinnacle of his career. He was a happy man. As far as we can see, happy in his own fussy, fastidious way, but a happy man. And everything was going just splendidly. And his whole world was turned upside down with the theft.
Vickers appeared to be off the hook. And Inspector Kane now began to question the other office staff, focusing particularly on 3 of Sir Arthur's junior heralds. But was Kane any closer to cracking the case? 2 weeks after his investigation had begun, the chief inspector unexpectedly returned to London. Around the world, the Empire waited for Kane to submit his report, but nothing came. A strange silence descended. Had the investigation into the jewel heist of the century stalled?
So the investigation is going nowhere. And in the nature of these things, somebody has to pay for it. If you can't get the thieves, you've got to get somebody. There has to be a sacrificial lamb. The king, conscious of the fact that these jewels were a present from one of his antecedents to the Order of St. Patrick, and that they are royal jewels, begins to take a hand. And he wants at least one head, or hopefully more than that, to roll.
Many of the staff of the office were either dismissed or resigned. But Arthur Vickers had fought hard to get into the Office of Arms in 1892, and he was not going to give up without a fight. He simply couldn't understand that because he himself had not stolen the jewels, that he should be sacked so ignominiously.
He refuses to go. He wants a public inquiry and demands a public inquiry.
My desire above all things is to vindicate my honor, and I appeal to your excellency not to blast my career and reputation without at least giving me that which the most humblest subject of His Majesty is entitled, the opportunity of clearing my character and conduct before any tribunal that His Excellency may select. I am, sir, your obedient servant, Arthur Vickers.
Aberdeen got a firm royal command to dismiss Sir Arthur Vickers, but he didn't do it. Why? He tries to buy off Sir Arthur Vickers with a pension. It didn't work. Lord Aberdeen was vulnerable because his son, Lord Haddo, was a friend of Sir Arthur Vickers. Lord Haddo had played this Christmas prank of stealing the jewels out of the safe and putting them on Sir Arthur Vickers' desk. So it would certainly reflect badly on the house. I think that was the major fear he had.
Now, since Edward himself was interested in relatively little, we have relatively few cases of his really wanting something. This was something he wanted. Therefore, it had to happen. And therefore, instructions are given that Vickers has to be ousted, if possible, with the greatest possible contumely. It was probably from Edward himself and his entourage that hints emerged: blacken his name, accuse him of homosexual associations, above all, unmentionable things. Don't even say something homosexual, simply give hints.
So they began a smear campaign. The smear campaign was a whispering campaign alleging that Sir Arthur Vickers was a practicing homosexual.
Rumours of the unmentionable spread through the smoke rooms of Dublin's clubs. Sir Arthur Vickers was thrust back into the limelight to witness the public decimation of his character and reputation.
People who had been tempted to intervene on behalf of Sir Arthur Vickers drew back. Now, stop me if you've heard this one before.
The tragedy that was now Arthur Vickers began to gather pace. The government were sure their whispering campaign would make him quietly cave in. But Vickers now had nothing to lose, and he desperately pushed for a formal commission of inquiry that would surely clear his name. "6 months after the theft of the Irish crown jewels, Vickers was finally granted his commission. But it was to be on the King's terms. Held in private back in the Bedford Tower, the Commission's only concern was who had been responsible for the jewels' safekeeping. Inexplicably, nobody seemed remotely interested in who actually stole the jewels or where they were now. The Commission was over before it had begun. Vickers was finished.
The end was sad in the extreme. He knew that there was no point in trying to contest the final decision of the Commission of Inquiry. The notice of dismissal is posted on the 30th of January 1908, and his career is finished.
Vickers was now a social pariah. The Whispering Campaign had seen to that. Though always loyal to the King, Vickers was now a testament to the dark side of the Crown's influence, and no one seemed to know why. Unemployable and destitute, Arthur moved to Kerry, forced to live off his family's generosity. As the years passed, Arthur Vickers spent much of his time obsessing over the details of the theft. All the clues seemed to point to an inside job, but the Crown seemed satisfied that only he, custodian of the jewels, be punished. The King's jewels were still missing, the thief was still at large, and the police had never issued a report of their findings. Was the case even still open? The more he looked, the more questions appeared unanswered. But forces were at work that Vickers could not have dreamt of. Forces working to bury forever the true story behind the Irish crown jewels. A story that could plunge the King and the Empire into a morass of scandal and sodomy. Royal revelations of the most damaging kind.
Scotland Yard do have a file on this whole investigation and this whole controversy, which they allowed me to see some years ago. And there's no doubt about it. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that the file has been very carefully vetted.
The material in the genealogical office today has striking gaps. The official correspondence of the office ends in 1902 and doesn't start again until 1908.
You have an entire police report on the Dublin end of things has disappeared. Compounding that, you have Scotland Yard's report, which was probably built on a lot of their material, but also on Chief Inspector Kane's own inquiries. That report has disappeared. That's a major cover-up, just to begin with.
So it was something that whilst they would want to get to the truth of it, they must have been aware at a very early stage that the truth might not be something they wished to have publicised.
The absence of even the most mundane documents has been the source of rumour and speculation for nearly 100 years. The chief investigator, John Kane, wrote a report that was never filed. Officially, it didn't even exist, although such an important document was hard to disappear completely. In Parliament 10 years after the theft, hard questions were still being asked. In an angry exchange, Augustine Birrell, the Irish secretary, accidentally let it slip that a police report had indeed existed, and even more crucially, that a suspect had in fact been named.
As I have already stated, no criminal proceedings were instituted because there was no evidence to justify such proceedings.
Why were no criminal proceedings taken against the persons implicated in this inspector's report?
The honourable member may choose to say that they were implicated. All I can say is there was no evidence to justify the executive taking any proceedings against any of the persons named.
Now, we know the report does exist, and we also know that Kane named the person or persons who he suspected of having committed the crime.
Who was the person named in Kane's report? It appears Kane had concluded that the thief was a staff member of the Office of Arms at Dublin Castle. somewhere in that pack of suspects was the guilty party. The safe containing the Irish crown jewels had been opened with a key, and Sir Arthur Vickers held the only copy of that key. Access to the key meant that the thief had to be close to Vickers, and this eliminated from the investigation all but his inner circle of junior heralds. Vickers had close personal connections with all three of these men. Pierce Gunn Mahoney was Vickers' nephew, and Francis Bennett Goldney was a close friend. Both had alibis. But as the investigation deepened, the third man was becoming more and more embroiled with the fate of the jewels. His name was Francis Richard Shackleton.
Vickers' first theory in relation to who had stolen the jewels was the smart boys from London, what he refers to, professional thieves, had come in and stolen them. Then, little by little, he comes round to the point of view that somebody inside the Office of Arms has been involved in the theft. So little by little, Vickers begins to believe that Shackleton was responsible for the theft of the jewels, and therefore, by extension, was responsible for bringing all hell down on top of Vickers himself.
Frank Shackleton is a key figure. Automatically, when you read the evidence, he would be your prime suspect.
Frank Shackleton was the younger brother of Sir Ernest Shackleton, the famous polar explorer. Frank was ex-military and came from good Anglo-Irish stock.
He was extremely popular. He was a bit of a playboy, tremendously handsome. He got on well in high society. He was a social climber.
After Vickers had employed Frank Shackleton, they both decided to share the expense of a house in a Dublin suburb. Frank would spend only 3 months a year here, but generously offered to pay half the rent.
The experts say that either the original key or a perfect copy was used. Frank Shackleton was the man, almost the only other man who could have got his hands on the keys, because he was a co-tenant with Sir Arthur and had the free run of the house, and there was a spare key to the safe kept in the house.
Shackleton also presented himself as a wealthy London stockbroker, but by 1907 he was totally broke and desperately searching for solutions.
Frank Shackleton was a crook. He was made the financial agent for Lord Gower, and he helped himself to £85,000. Left him completely broke, and we believe he probably did it to quite a number of people. He had a reputation, an unsavory reputation in the city for shady dealings.
Owed a huge amount of money to various banks and various individuals, had already defrauded other individuals, and more money was being poured in to this Mexican timber black hole, which he had created in the hope of making financial killings.
So he was definitely a crook. He was a man who had no conscience in terms of stealing.
By June 1907, many people knew how casual the security was in Bedford Tower. The previous Christmas, a friend of Vickers and Shackleton had, as a joke, temporarily pinched the crown jewels. For someone in severe financial distress, Lord Haddo's stunt was just the inspiration required.
As I understand it, the theft of the jewellery may have started off as a prank, but Mr. Shackleton, who was a bit of a larky boy, spotted how this had worked and decided to do something about it.
However, Francis Shackleton was not in Ireland at the time of the theft, so he could not actually have committed the theft himself. So who did commit the theft?
Even though he had a cast iron alibi, he was considered that he might have taken the key and given it to somebody to steal the jewels.
Enter Captain Richard Howard Gorges. Gorges and Shackleton had served together in the Boer War, and the two had rekindled their relationship when Gorges was posted to Ireland. Gorges was a shadowy, violent rogue with a deep grudge against the establishment, the perfect accomplice.
I do think that he and Shackleton were definitely involved, and I also think that Shackleton was more likely to be the person who dealt with the jewels and possibly used Gorges to get them out of the castle. Because of his job as a soldier, he had access to certain things in the castle.
So while Frank Shackleton remained visible in his London clubs, Captain Gorges in his soldier's uniform could easily enter and leave the Bedford Tower unnoticed by the castle guards. And using a duplicate key, supplied by Shackleton, the Irish crown jewels were there for the taking. Access to the key, motive and opportunity, all the evidence points to Frank Shackleton being the brains behind the operation. Yet Scotland Yard seemed unable or unwilling to take any action against him. Perhaps other forces were at work, as Frank Shackleton had already surfaced in another police investigation, one delving into the underworld of London society, and one that had revealed him to be a very active homosexual.
Being homosexual in the early part of the 20th century was something that was highly dangerous. It was very common. It was particularly common amongst aristocratic circles, amongst the British upper classes.
The police love watching homosexuals. It is a lovely police activity. It's reasonably comfortable. You wait outside buildings and you have a sense that you're dealing with, as a Puritan, you're dealing with sort of a pure evil, something that is a form of perversion.
On the one hand, homosexuality will be at any drop of the hat condemned as the abomination which may not be named among decent Christians. And the very same people who may condemn it as such, maybe if not necking themselves with attractive footmen or whatever in the conservatory, may certainly be on the very best of terms with people whom they know are.
If you were known to be a homosexual, it was possible to be blackmailed, and possible perhaps to be blackmailed into doing something that you didn't want to do.
And from that point of view, one of the best ways to protect yourself was you get some information at the expense of somebody else who was in a position they could guard you.
Was Frank Shackleton now using the power of blackmail for his own protection, and against whom? The police appeared completely unable to use Shackleton's homosexuality to prise a confession from him. For some reason, Scotland Yard's investigation had stalled. We now know why. In September 1907, the King's Man in Ireland, Lord Aberdeen, received a secret report, the contents of which were serious enough for Aberdeen to seek an urgent clandestine meeting with the King. Aberdeen revealed to a shocked monarch that Shackleton had a trump card. His relationship with the King's brother-in-law, the Duke of Argyll.
And that was one of the crucial events of this story, because at that stage the King learned fully that the Duke of Argyll was involved with Frank Shackleton. And the King knew full well that the Duke of Argyll was a homosexual, because the Duke of Argyll had an extraordinary reputation for running around after guardsmen.
Edward had little time for Argyll, but a potentially disastrous homosexual scandal was now beating at his door, and the political implications were explosive. At the turn of the century, royal homosexual scandals were cropping up all over Europe, and critics of the royal families were denouncing them as degenerates. The latest scandal had hit Edward's nephew, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Emperor of Germany. The mutual dislike between uncle and nephew was no secret. Both nations were amassing large armies and marching slowly towards war. In January 1907, several key members of the German royal court were outed as homosexuals. Much to the Kaiser's embarrassment, the group included his closest friend and confidant, Prince Eulenburg.
You know, this antipathy between Germany and Britain was the really dominant feature of European diplomacy from 1904 to 1914, and the British had enjoyed the Eulenburg scandals.
When news of this scandal was received in London, King Edward VII took great glee in writing to the Kaiser. Repeatedly, I hope that the troubles you're having with von Eulenburg are nothing trivial.
I think the Eulenburg affair in Germany did huge damage to the German royal family, and I think the royal family and the establishment in Britain would have been desperate to avoid a similar scandal.
And that's what the king was afraid of. I mean, it's the guilt by association was going to kill the Duke of Argyll. Once Shackleton became exposed, the Duke of Argyll's name was attached to him. And that was the real problem for the king. And once he became aware of that, he had a very clear objective. Forget the jewels, keep the Duke of Argyll's name out of it.
Argyll was too close to the king for comfort. And that is a crucial fact, because that connection is the connection which could have given Shackleton at least some immunity from prosecution.
The Duke of Argyll was married to the king's favourite sister, and the family had thus far managed to keep his insatiable homosexual appetites as a royal secret and out of the eyes of the press. Shackleton must be kept silent. The evidence now uncovered suggests that King Edward was effectively Shackleton's protector. The king wanted Shackleton kept out of the witness box, whatever the cost.
It's almost mind-boggling to think that the King of England was going to keep protecting this man, even knowing the fact that he was the one who had stolen his jewels, or helped to steal the jewels. It's just the power of blackmail.
So while the most likely culprit remained free, an innocent man was being destroyed. Whiling away the years in North Kerry, Vickers could only ponder his destruction at the hands of one of the most powerful men in the world. But the jewels would bring no luck to anyone. Edward's reign was short-lived. Within 3 years of the jewel heist, the king was dead. The months following his death heralded the collapse of Frank Shackleton's world. Arrested, tried, and imprisoned for fraud, there was little his famous brother Ernest could do to help him, or his £100,000 debt. On his release, Shackleton retired to Chichester to live as Frank Miller, dying in the 1940s, a forgotten man. At the age of 53, Arthur Vickers married, but happiness was to elude him. By 1921, Ireland was changing and the War of Independence raged. Sir Arthur, still loyal, felt honor-bound to serve his new king, George V. But support for the Crown forces was not viewed at all well in staunchly Republican North Kerry. For the second time in his life following his convictions would be the undoing of Arthur Vickers.
It's sad that his life should have ended as violently and as unnecessarily as it did. To be shot before the blazing ruins of your home with your wife looking on almost defies belief.
Before his death, he makes a will. And in this will, he is still obsessed with the whole Crown Jewels controversy.
Will and testament of Sir Arthur Vickers. In the name of... I might have had more to dispose of if it had not been for the outrageous way in which I was treated by the Irish government over the loss of the Irish Crown Jewels in 1900. They shielded the real culprit and thief, Francis R. Shackleton, brother of the explorer who didn't use the South.
So right up to his death, to his grave, Sir Arthur Vickers carries with him the conviction that the Crown Jewels have been stolen by Frank Shackleton.
The death of Arthur Vickers might well have been the final chapter in the story of the Irish Crown Jewels. But the story refuses to die. In 1998, a nephew of Arthur Vickers' valet, still living on Vickers' estate, received a series of anonymous messages relating to the whereabouts of the jewels.
And suddenly one night, 3:30 in the morning, I get a phone call. If you want the evidence, would you go down to the old orchard wall at the west door and you'll find something there. Which I was very scared to do, but I did take a walk down there through the dark.
I was almost scared of the ghost of Sir Arthur, because I thought wherever the jewel would have been, his spirit would surely be with him.
An ornate carved stone was left as a calling card. There were no jewels. It was an elaborate hoax. Officially, at least, the Irish Crown Jewels have never been found, and such a treasure trove of diamonds is still an irresistible lure for many people.
Aside altogether from the number of reported discoveries over the years, attempted hoaxes, all of this kind of stuff, which has gone on and which has surrounded this whole story for almost a century now, there was at least one more fluttering in the dovecot.
In 1927, the Irish government were offered the castle jewels for a fraction of their value. No one seems to know where the offer came from. President W.T. Cosgrave initially recommended their purchase.
They were offered to the Irish government in the 20s for, I think, £2,000 or £3,000. Now, of course, that was a lot more money then than it is now, but even so, it's not the kind of staggering amount of money you expect for royal jewellery.
If they'd been offered to the Irish state, one would expect the Irish state to have purchased them and displayed them, unless they felt it was an unacceptable part of their history they were not interested in.
At that very time, the last thing in the world they could afford to do would be seen as spending Irish public money upon the retention of one of the most tawdry examples of the imperial connection. It was as if they would have been spending money to prove that they were what De Valera and company were constantly hinting they were, the lickspittles of the British monarchy.
And so with each passing generation, the mysterious whereabouts of the king's jewels continues to confound. Their guardians, the most illustrious Knights of St. Patrick, have long ceased to exist. Given their remarkable history, the jewels themselves would be a priceless find today. But treasure hunters beware. Almost all those connected with the Irish crown jewels met with a tragic end. And until this case is solved, the unhappy spirit of Arthur Vickers, disgraced Ulster King of Arms, will never be at peace.
Where are the jewels? I wish I could.
Who could possibly have picked up the crown?
They were probably broken up.
There is always the loony American
My best
millionaire.
guess is that the jewels are back in the palace.
They're locked up somewhere in Windsor Castle or Buckingham Palace.
Everybody's very secretive about the whole thing, and that's what makes it so interesting.
If they still exist, then they should be returned to the sovereign because they are crown jewels.